It's 2024, it's time for a war!
Hello, one and all. Ladies and gentlemen, it is I, Brendon, coming back at you with another video. Today, as promised, I'm going to focus on drums, and I'm using the example of our song that just came out called Time for a War. So if you haven't checked out Time for a War, please go do that. I'll leave a link in the description. So in the mix breakdown video, I pretty much showed you all the mix stuff, but what I want to do today is show you some of the techniques that I use to give drums a little more energy, make them a little more exciting. Because if you've done any mixing, you know a lot of times drums can be kind of dull sounding when they first start out. So I'm going to show you some stuff that I do to resolve that issue. Now, as always, this is not a tutorial. You can use what I'm showing you wholesale, or you can adjust it to work with your workflow, or you can go down in the comments and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. The third of those options is probably the most popular. Anyway, before I get started, if you'll do me a favor and do some of that stuff, or all of that stuff that's on the screen right now, that would really help me out. And with that, let's get to work. So you can see here in Reaper, I have our drums laid out. They are audio files. You can't see any of the other tracks. In order to make this easier, I have them hidden. However, I do have this VCA down here. If I turn on the mixer, you can see that VCA here, and it's muted. And if I roll the track, you're just going to hear the drums. But if it unmutes the rest of the tracks, so you can hear the whole arrangement.
Try, we can take it to 3 fronts or more.
So if you're looking at that purple track and wondering what it is, that's what it is. The first thing I want to talk about is MIDI drums. If you're a singer-songwriter and you're doing your music super DIY, like we are in Repo Man, or maybe it's you just can't find a drummer to work with. Believe me, I understand how that is. A perfectly good option is to use MIDI drums. But when using MIDI drums, there is one thing that is often forgotten about, and so I want to look at that really quick. So here is a MIDI file that I made. I'm not going to show how I did that because the tool I used is not free, but I am going to show you a free tool. And that is ML Drums, which is what we're using in this example. ML Drums is absolutely something you can download for free in its base form. And it works great. It sounds great. It has a really useful mixer. You can map the MIDI any way you want. It's really great, and you can download it for free. I have no affiliation with this company. Let me be clear about that, but there is a link in the description. ML Drums is great. There's also Steven Slate drums. There's also BFD Lite. You have many free options. Anyway, here is this MIDI file that I've created. And if I double click it, it brings up our MIDI editor. And you can see all these colors from red, yellow, orange. Basically, that color signifies the velocity of these hits. So, for instance, if I grab this fader right here, you can see this note. Let me see if I can find it. You can see this note right here changes, and let me zoom in on that a little bit. Right? So you're looking at this note right here, and if I pull this up and down, it changes in color to green, which means not a very hard hit. And then if I move it all the way up, it changes to red again. Whoops. Changes to red again, which is the hardest possible hit. Why is this important? Well, in the intro here, I want my virtual drummer really going for it. I want him really hitting the drums hard, right? Because there's no singing. And we want the listener to get excited about this. We want to perk their ears out, like, oh wow, listen to that. That's really aggro. I like aggro. I want to listen to this. So here I've got mostly orange and red because I've got this drummer really beating the crap out of these drums. When we get into the verse and Mike starts singing, we bring it down a little bit. We're bringing down the intensity, not necessarily volume. We're just bringing down the intensity. The drummer's not hitting as hard, and that probably sounds more realistic.
Gather round, it's time for a war. If we try, we can take it to 3 fronts or more.
Then later in the song, when we get to a more intense part again,
It's about time for a war. If we don't do something, gonna kill us all. Nobody's gonna.
so that would be the bridge, right? So we're coming back up, and then we get into the ending of the song. Forgive me, that's the instrumental section. I'm sorry. So getting into the very end, now we're seeing this full screen, but if we get into the very end, you can see that it's all red because now we're really, really at, kind of the zenith of the intensity of the song.
2024, it's time for a war. 2024, it's time for a war.
So again, the intro, he's really hitting. Then when we get into the verse and Mike is singing, we bring it down a little bit. Then in the choruses, we come up a little more. Anyway, adjusting your velocities like this will really make your MIDI drums sound super realistic because I don't care how good a real drummer is, the idea that they're going to be able to play at maximum intensity for a whole 3 minutes of a song or whatever, that's just too much to ask. And if everything was all red and orange, it would be boring. You wouldn't have any ebb and flow of intensity. So that's why we're doing that, and that is the first thing that I do whenever I'm dealing with MIDI drums is make sure that I've got some dynamics in the velocity mapping. Okay, getting back to audio tracks again. You can see here that I've got a kick, a snare. I've got our second snare. We covered that in the mix breakdown. That's in the verses. It's a more laid back snare to go along with the lower velocity that we just talked about. I've got a tom. I've got a hi-hat track. Then I've got a ride cymbal, which is only being used in the end in these breakdown parts. Let me get the music in here.
It's about time for a war.
That's where my ride cymbal is being used apparently. And then I've got an overhead track. What you'll see next is there's a room track and a room crush track. That is what that says. If I bring up the mixer, you can see room crush. Problem is there's no audio in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create room tracks. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to turn off all my effects. In Reaper, you do that like this. Okay. Now I'm going to render this as a stereo file. What I'm doing is I'm rendering the bus, which means I'm going to get a mix down of all of the drums to a stereo file. So I'm doing that now. See, this says render tracks to stereo stem tracks and mute originals. So that's what I'm going to do. Now I just have to unmute this again, turn all my effects back on. And here is my room track. And then I can delete this lane. Perfect. So here's our room. I'm going to bring the mixer back up. And I'm going to do what I typically have to do to make a room sound. I've got this turned up a little bit more now. Let's listen to it again. So that sounds like it's right out of the mixer, which it is. What we want to do is make it sound more like a room. So I'm going to add an EQ. This is a free plugin. There's a link in the description. It's called the Tokyo Dawn Records Slick EQ. I'm taking out I've taken out a low shelf below 200 hertz. I'm adding some mid-range at 800 hertz, and I'm taking down everything above 3000 hertz. So here's what that sounds like. Here's without it. Here's with it. Okay, so the reason I'm doing that is room mics are far away. And we know what happens whenever you have a mic far away from something. It picks up less low end, it picks up less high end, and it gets a lot more room. Unfortunately, we don't have any room because we just bounced this down right from the mixer. When I say we don't have any room, I mean we don't have any room sound. So the next thing I'm going to add is some reverb. And this is just the reverb that came with my DAW. I don't really have to show you a free reverb. I'm sure your DAW came with one. When I say DAW, I'm talking about Digital Audio Workstation. That's Reaper like I'm using, or Cubase, or Studio One, or Pro Tools. So here's with my reverb. Here's without it, which you already heard. Here it is again. So you see we've got a little more ambience in that now. And I realize it's not that big of a deal, but it sounds like a room mic. So here we go. We're going to mix that in. Actually going to turn my monitors up a little bit. Okay, that sounds great. I'm going to now get rid of the mixer again, and we're going to create this room crush thing. I'm going to copy this to the other track. And now I'm going to add the same EQ and the same reverb. Now I'm going to add a whole bunch of compression. And let's solo that so we can hear it. Turn this up. So this is Rough Rider 3, also free. Also a link for it in the description. You can see on this meter the gray parts. That's what we're compressing. you can see that gray part is going all the way down to the bottom of the meter. That means we're really compressing. We're really taking a lot out. You can see my ratio is like 8-1. We're really squashing this. Okay, so that's great. And then we're going to add some saturation. Honestly, more like full-on distortion. And we're going to use G-Sets, free plugin. There's a link in the description. And here's what that sounds like. Okay, so your question probably is, why on earth would you do that? Here's why. Because now you have a fader of aggression. Hear how everything becomes more alive when you do that? So, for instance, like I was saying, we've got massive, we're really hitting the apex of our intensity in the end of the song. And so right before that, we've got these breakdowns. Sorry, the gate probably cut me off. We've got these breakdown sections. Let me turn the music on. So listen, as we get into that ending, the 2024, it's time for a war, I'm going to turn this up and you can hear the excitement increase. If I mute the music, that might be easier to hear. So now I can automate that if I want. So I'm just trying to give you ideas. Again, this is a just an example of how I do things. That's something you can do. Compress the hell out of your drum room mics, add distortion, and then you can increase the excitement with that fader. Okay? Moving right along, while I've got the mixer up, I'm going to show you that on the kick drum, I've got some plugins I'm using. I'm using this SSL channel strip. I'm not using the compressor. I'm not using anything but the EQ. You can see I've got a high pass at about 60 hertz, and I'm adding some high frequencies, and I'm adding some mid-range. The high frequency I'm adding is about 8K, and then the mid-range I'm adding is about 4K. And that's because these drum recordings, these drum samples that I'm using are kind of made to be universal, and in a funk song or a slower ballad, you know, this super fat kick drum might be pretty cool, but in this rock song, I don't want all that. I just want it to be really cutting and more modern sounding. If I wanted to go real modern, you know, like metalcore modern, I would take both of these and probably just turn them all the way up. Maybe that's too much, but you understand what I'm saying. Like the modern metalcore kick is really bright. Anyway, I think that sounds great. Problem is, this plugin's not free. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use our friend Slicky Q again, link in the description. You can see once again, I'm afraid the gate cut me off again. So you can see once again, I've got a high pass filter. I'm taking away some, actually I'm not doing anything with the lows. I'm adding some mid-range and I'm adding some highs. It sounds basically the same, and if I bring those up at the same time, when you see this check mark go from here to here, it means I'm switching back and forth. So I'm going to roll the track and I'm going to do that. So anyway, I think this Slicky Q honestly sounds great. There's a little bit of a volume difference. I didn't normalize the volumes. Sorry about that. You get the idea. This totally free plugin works just as well as this not free plugin. So there's a link in the description. Go get it. BSA Clipper is a plugin that I use a lot on drums for various reasons, but it doesn't have to be that. A great free clipper is K-Clip 0. So if I turn this on, you can see it doing its thing. So those red lines right there are where it's clipping. Which is fine, because it's just lopping off a couple of samples. It's pretty much inaudible. It just makes the kick drum nice and loud, nice and punchy. Clipping is kind of a controversial topic. So if you don't want to use clipping, that's up to you. There's different schools of thought on that. Snare. I'm not going to go through all these instruments, but I just want one more example. On the snare, I'm using this plugin. You can see I'm not doing any filtering. I'm just adding high and high mid again. But that plugin's not free. So TDR Slicky Q it is. And as you can hear, that's very similar sounding. Once again, BSA Clipper. Who needs it? K-Clip 0 works great. By the way, I'm not throwing shade at BSA Clipper. I actually really like that plugin. I just want to give you a free alternative. MPX Reverb. I can use the reverb that came with my DAW instead. Great. So every one of these channels, well, not on the toms, but that nobody cares about that. I'm going to switch over to all these free plugins that I have loaded up. Like, for instance, on the overheads, I've got a UAD DBX 160. And I really like that plugin, but we can get away with using Rough Rider. So I'm using Rough Rider. Anyway, so now I've gotten rid of all of my paid plugins, except on the bus, and I'm just using the free stuff. And I think it sounds great. I should probably unsolo the overheads. Here we go. Speaking of the bus, I'm going to go over this really quick because I don't want this video to be too long. Oxford Inflator. We're now listening to the bus. So all the drums are going through Oxford Inflator. But there's a free option, which is called JS Inflator. There's a link in the description. It's free. So we don't necessarily need Oxford Inflator, although I do love Oxford Inflator. A note on these inflator plugins, I usually just put them in, right? So I just bypassed it, and you can hear how much it's doing, right? If I bypass it, and then I turn it on, it's doing very little. All I do is put it on the track, and in this case, I had to turn this in fader up a little bit, but I mean, it's doing very little. Again, if you have great tracks, you're 90% of the way. I'm just adding a couple of percent with these plugins. Okay, so I've also got the Shadow Hills Class A mastering compressor. Not only is it not free, it's not particularly inexpensive. I got it on sale. Anyway, it's great. Great compressor. Love it. But we can use Rough Rider instead. Sounds great. BSA Clipper again. We already know. We can use K-Clip 0. And honestly, when I set up this example, I probably have that clipping a little too much. Let's back that off slightly. That's better. And then I have this reverb. Once again, we can use our reverb that came with our DAW. It's actually clipping a little bit. That's better. Anyway, so there's a bunch of free plugins that you can use. In review, we covered adding some dynamics, not necessarily to volume, but adding some intensity dynamics with your velocities of your MIDI notes. We talked about adding rooms. Well, adding a room mic set, and then also duplicating that and compressing the snot out of it and adding some distortion to add excitement. And then I showed you some plugins that you can use that are all free and are all linked in the description. And with those plugins being used, here's what it sounds like.
Gather round, it's time for a war. If we try, we can take it to 3 fronts or more.
And I think that sounds pretty darn good. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it gave you some ideas. Again, if you don't like my ideas, I'd love the engagement of you going in the comments and telling me I'm full of crap. And while on that topic, if you could do all that stuff that's on the screen right now, or at least some of it, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and go listen to Time for a War. Also a link in the description. Have a great day, and I almost forgot. Happy New Year. Cheers.
It's 2024, it's time for a war.